Got it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shannon. Welcome to another edition of Rise Beyond OCD. Answers, insight, and inspiration to move forward. I love doing this series. I do it a couple of times a month, and it really is interviews with the icons of the OCD recovery community. I know all of the people that are on here. I can proudly say met all of them through my involvement with the International OCD Foundation. I'm very grateful that they are participating and they see the value in what we're trying to do here. So I'm glad everybody is here and watching this, whether you're living with OCD, supporting someone you love, or working in the mental health field. This is a caring space where we can learn, connect, and find hope together. And just a quick reminder, what we share today is meant for education and support. It is not a substitute for professional care. And if you ever find yourself in crisis, please reach out. You can call or text 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline or 911 if there is an immediate danger. And for international support, visit findahelpline.com. You are not alone. Healing and recovery are possible, and we are here to move forward together. And before I introduce our very special guest today, a couple of other housekeeping items. Today's interview is being live streamed. The interview, like all of the other interviews in this Rise Beyond OCD series, is being recorded for later viewing on my YouTube channel and on my website, ocdrecoveryturningpoints.com. Everyone will be muted, and your videos can be on or off however you want, except Katie's and mine, of course. The chat room is open. I ask everyone to be respectful of others and maintain decorum. We have never, ever had a problem with that. I don't expect we'll have it today. And we will have a Q&A at the end before my final question. And if you have a question, please put it in the chat. If your chat is not working, just like jump up and down vigorously and I'll try to see you as we go. Okay, so it is my great honor to introduce our special guest today, Reverend Dr. Katie O'Dunn. Do you want me to call you Reverend Dr. O'Dunn or
Please
how's
call
that
me
work?
Katie. I
Okay,
always
Katie.
I always tell folks when I introduce myself, I like folks to know I'm a minister because I want folks to know that ministers can have OCD, but beyond that, I'm pretty informal. So just call me Katie.
Okay, well, you heard it from her, not from me. Okay, Reverend Dr. Katie O'Dunn, from here on out, Katie, founded and leads an inclusive virtual community for those navigating faith and OCD called Stick with the Ick. An ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, she spent 7 years as the Academy chaplain and chair of religious studies at Woodward Academy in Atlanta, simultaneously consulting on interfaith programming nationwide. Drawing on this experience, Katie educates clinicians and clergy, promoting culturally responsive treatment across religious/spiritual traditions. She leads the International OCD Foundation, IOCDF, Faith and Action Council, consults on religion and OCD with the OCDI Texas, and received Vanderbilt's Doctor of Ministry Award for distinction in integrative care practices. Dr. O'Dunn received the International OCD Foundation's Advocate Spirit Award in 2023. So, Katie, welcome to the program. I am so honored that you're here. You are always just this source of hope, exuberance, positivity. You are so welcoming and warming to anyone who approaches you. And I've observed this countless times at the International OCD Foundation conference. You're just a beautiful spirit, helpful to so many. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. Such an honor.
Okay, let's jump into it. Could you start by sharing um, a little about your experience with OCD and how OCD intersected over time with your faith?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I've navigated OCD since before I can remember, which I think is the experience for so many of us. Some of my earliest memories, even when I was 6 or 7 or 8, involved going around my living room and doing things in a particular way or touching things in a particular order to try to keep people safe. And I always think back to one of my first major OCD themes I remember being in elementary school and my teacher saying something about the sun getting too close to the earth someday and everyone dying. I'm sure she framed it differently than that, but that's what I took in from that experience through my OCD lens. And I became convinced that if I prayed correctly, that if I did everything right, that if I touched things in the right order, that I could protect the entire planet. And that's a lot of pressure for an elementary school kid. And shortly after that, my aunt passed away to cancer, and I thought it was my fault because I hadn't protected everyone enough. My mom took me to my first therapist at that point where I was not diagnosed with OCD because as so many of us know, there's such a unfortunately usually a long wait time before you actually find that it's OCD or you find the right treatment. So we played a lot of checkers and I didn't get better, but I pretended to get better because I wanted my therapist to think he was doing a good job. I was scared that he would get fired if he wasn't. So I told him all of my thoughts went away, was totally better, was great, and continued to move on throughout my life where OCD got bigger and bigger, but I got even better at hiding it and not letting folks know what I was experiencing. It started to especially get really big for me. Well, I masked it in a lot of different ways, but it started to really explode, especially by the time I was in my early 20s and I was in seminary. So I was pursuing ordained ministry and I moved to Atlanta, Georgia to do my Master of Divinity at Emory. And it started to just attach to everything under the sun I was doing. I was no longer sleeping. I was driving back to churches where I was interning to make sure that things were unlocked and that candles were blown out and that people were safe on the streets. And I was taking a psych course because of a dual degree program that I was doing at the School of Public Health. And I started to recognize that I might have this thing called OCD. So at the time, I went to one of my mentors and said, I think I have OCD and I think I need to get help. And unfortunately, I was told not to. I was told that I was an up and coming minister and that I wouldn't pass my psych evaluations if anybody knew, and that I just needed to keep this quiet and that I shouldn't share it with anybody. So I felt so much shame, and then it felt like, well, I can't get help for this thing I'm experiencing. I'll just keep pushing it down. And ended up getting ordained. And at 25, moved into my first role as the academy chaplain at the biggest private school in the US. So I was the religious leader for 2,700 students and families.
Mm.
I was the first female in the role, and I was 25 with undiagnosed, untreated OCD. My predecessor had been there for 25 years, and I felt this extreme pressure to get it right,
Sure.
to not let anybody know what I was experiencing. And externally, it looked like I did really well in the role with teaching and pastoral care and all of these things. Internally, OCD took over absolutely everything for me. And I ultimately kind of the short version of my story hit rock bottom when I experienced a number of tragedies where I lost students that I was very close with. And I was responsible for supporting the community, but my OCD latched onto those very same losses. And I thought that I was very tangibly responsible because of harm OCD, because of false memory OCD, because of scrupulosity. So I got to the point where I hated myself. I was calling the police to confess to crimes I hadn't committed. I was officiating funerals thinking this thing is my fault. I'm awful. I don't deserve to be here. And very thankfully, it was then that I started to engage in evidence-based treatment. And at the time, it was before teletherapy was as big as it is now with post-COVID land. I was very thankful to find a therapist that would do more intensive therapy with me virtually. And so I could continue in my role, and no one knew what I was experiencing. And it was pretty awful. I would go through a full day of supporting folks while ruminating 24/7, thinking I was a murderer, and would do intensive treatment at night. And we'll get into more of that, but I got better. And for the first time, I didn't want to be quiet about my experience anymore, partially because some of the students I lost were to their own mental health struggles that they hadn't come forward with, and partially because I had been told earlier in my ministry journey that I wasn't allowed to tell anybody, and I didn't want other ministers to experience that. So I let a group of my students write an article about the chaplain who had been seeking OCD treatment in secret and blasted out to 2,700 families, and I thought I would be fired. And it was actually the opposite. I started hearing from folks that they wanted to be able to talk to their priest, to their rabbi, to their imam. And we'll get into more of this, but that's really what shifted everything that I do into work around faith and OCD was from a place of my own pain and struggle, but also a place of recognizing that recovery is so possible and wanting my students from different faith backgrounds to be able to reclaim their lives.
Oh, that's awesome. And so there are many different themes, if that's the right word, or subject areas where OCD attacks. I mean, it could be harm, responsibility, religious scrupulosity, moral scrupulosity, go on down the line. And so for someone in sort of a religious life, a leader in religious life, you could talk to this from many different angles. One probably. So let's just move to this question and it will flow from there. For people who may be struggling quietly with OCD in religious contexts, what parts of your own story might resonate most with them?
Uh, um, Gosh, on the personal side, I think the shame that so many experience. For me, it was the shame of being told that I was a minister, so I couldn't let anybody know, or that there was shame around that. I often hear from folks now in the professional capacity that they don't come forward because they're worried that they'll be judged, or they've been told that if you're experiencing this mental health struggle, you're not praying hard enough or you're not faithful enough, which couldn't be, gosh, further from the truth. I think that is a huge piece for me. I think also this more in my younger years, but this component of religious practice becoming compulsive. And I know we'll get into that a little bit more with scrupulosity stuff. But for me, when I was a kid, I spent so much time praying and doing things in a certain way just to keep people safe. And I always say when we get to that point, it's no longer about worshiping God or worshiping the divine. It's actually about kind of worshiping OCD in a weird way. And I think that so many can relate to that, where we start to engage in these practices no longer because we're connecting with something beyond ourselves, but because we're trying to prevent something really bad and really scary from happening. And of course, because it feels real and scary. That's really, really challenging. And that can go off into so many directions with Scroop. But yeah, I think for me, both the shame and the OCD hijacking authentic religious practices.
Was there a particular moment when you realized that your experience with OCD and your ministry calling might intersect in a meaningful way?
It's a really interesting question. I've been reflecting on this a little bit. I'm writing a book on scrupulosity right now, and I've been kind of going back through the different phases of my journey. And I don't know that there was one. I think there were a lot of different things that kind of pointed to that. And for me, after the article came out about the chaplain with OCD, when I started hearing from students and from families, I became really passionate. I knew I wanted to do something to turn my pain into purpose. And I started doing work with the International OCD Foundation at the time. And it happened to be, and I would, from a faith perspective, say this was kind of a God moment here. They happened to be when they were trying to build out programming around faith and OCD. And I was working in interfaith chaplaincy. So I said, "Ooh, I would love to help with this first faith and OCD conference that y'all want to do." And I thought it would be a one and done type thing. And then we had about 1,000 people sign up virtually. And it's like, okay, there's a need for this. There's something here. So following that, there were so many little moments where I just felt kind of called to continue to do this work. I started hearing from clinicians that they were really struggling with separating faith from OCD and culturally responsive exposures, and that they needed more resources. So at the time, I was doing full-time school chaplaincy work during the day and consulting on cases all night and trying to build things and build resources. And I had all these little moments where it just felt like this is what I'm meant to do. This is, I don't know. I want to be able to help change and help people reclaim their lives, especially in faith communities. And the more moments that happened, ultimately I came to a point where I was at a wedding actually with an IOCDF board member who looked at me and was like, "Okay, Katie, there's a lot of faith and OCD stuff that you're doing. You get to walk through this door now. You can choose to do it or not to do it." So I ended up, after that conversation, taking a leap of faith and leaving my steady school chaplaincy job to go off into something very uncertain that later became a doctoral program where I focused on faith and OCD, and then later became Stick with the Ick and doing a ton of scrupulosity related work. But for me, it was really a series of moments in the community and just talking to people and hearing, I don't know, folks say that they wanted to engage with their faith and treatment at the same time, and recognizing that, I might be able to help and support with that in meaningful.
Uh, that's a beautiful story. And I tell people all the time, with recovery, good things follow.
Yeah.
And all of this just opening up, and well, there's another point of view where you could say no good deed goes unpunished, right? So you could keep going and going and going. All right, let's segue into religious scrupulosity then. Um, many people have never heard the term religious scrupulosity. How would you explain it in a way that both sufferers and faith leaders can understand?
Yes. This is my favorite question. I love getting to talk about this. So I always like to start with the ways that I describe OCD, which may be different than what folks have heard. If folks have heard me speak on this before, I'm sorry because you're going to get a little bit of repetition. But I like to describe OCD as nasty ice cream that happens to show up in a lot of different gross artificial flavors. Flavors might be different, they might taste different, they might smell different, but it's all the same gross OCD ice cream where we have the obsession, the discomfort in the form of fear or guilt or shame or anxiety. And then we have the compulsion, the thing that we're trying to do to get rid of that doesn't actually help us get rid of it because we get back into that cycle. But of all of the gross ice cream flavors that you could possibly imagine under the sun, scrupulosity is the one that happens to relate to religiosity or morality. And I always say the ice cream flavors, the really gross ones, really, oh, and thank you. I'm glad folks in the chat like the ice cream analogy. But I always say that the flavors tend to be about the things that are the most important to us, the most significant to us. So if OCD latches on to the things most significant to you, of course, for people that their faith is important or their morality is important, it's going to show up there. And it's not because it's a faith issue or a morality issue. It's because OCD is taking the thing that you care about so much and twisting it. So scrupulosity is just that. It's a form of OCD, a flavor of OCD latching on to your religion and to your morality. And I always like to remind folks that, or to let folks know that the word scrupulosity comes from the Latin scrupulum, which means small sharp stone. And I always imagine that there's kind of this little sharp stone in our shoe. And the more we pay attention to it, I'm a runner. So I'll often think if I pay attention to it while I'm running, if I want it to get smaller, if I want it to get out, the more it's going to seem bigger and bigger and bigger to start to take over our life. And scrupulosity is just that, where it takes over life, but in particular, it takes over faith and morality. It makes us question our relationship with the divine and everything meaningful to us.
How does scrupulosity differ from sincere religious devotion
Yeah.
or healthy spiritual discipline?
Yeah. Um, one of the reasons that I love doing this work is it can be really hard to differentiate if you're just looking at someone from the outside. So often faith leaders will see folks with scrupulosity and think, wow, this person's really devout, or they're just ritually washing a lot, or going to the confession a lot, or engaging in prayer or puja a lot. And there's kind of a couple different facets. It's scrupulosity. Someone is engaging in things beyond normative practice. And this can look different in different communities, but they're going beyond what others within their denomination or their sect would be engaging in. But the biggest piece is really why someone might be engaging in the behavior. What is the function of why they're engaging in their particular faith practices? So, are they engaging in confession, prayer, anything from a space of meaning and connection and joy and hope? Or is it from a space of fear and guilt and shame and urgency and anxiety? And sometimes those same practices might fit into different categories even on the same day. So I always tell folks you might pray in the morning in a way that's really value driven and later in the day in a way that's really compulsive. But scrupulosity is really, I always really kind of lay it out based on the function of why we're engaging in something. So with authentic religious practice, you're seeking to connect with God. You are feeling this meaning, this connection, this community. And then you're engaging in a spiritual practice that reflects that. With scrupulosity, It's all coming from a what if or an intrusive thought of, well, what if I've done something bad? What if I'm not good enough? What if I'm not faithful enough? What if I've sinned? Getting that discomfort. And then the practice that you're engaging in repetitively or to the point of quote unquote perfection is to alleviate that discomfort, not in an effort necessarily to get closer to God in an authentic way.
What are some I'm gonna skip a question here because you just raised it, and I think this is a good segue into it. For someone who might be wondering if their spiritual struggles are actually OCD, what are some signs that could indicate that it is OCD or it's a or it might be OCD, scrupulosity, theme?
Yeah, I think this, and I always like to kind of lay this out for faith leaders too. So for clergy, if we have any clergy watching, if someone is coming to you, I always say the urgency, the repetition, I have to get this right. And scrupulosity can look like spiritual struggles, but it presents in really different ways. I think it's very different when someone is coming to me with theological questions or saying, I'm in this place of grief, or I really want to understand forgiveness from this place of genuine curiosity, or because I'm at this point in my life. That looks really different than if it's couched in, I need to find this answer right now in the next 5 minutes, or something horrible is going to happen. And being able to name urgency, repetition, fear, guilt, shame, I think are really big components to separate that out. And sometimes folks will poke at me a little bit with the fear piece because fear in, whether we're talking about Christianity or Judaism or Islam, fear sometimes is seen as something that's authentic in practice. But the fear that we see in OCD is a little bit different. When we're talking about fear from a religious standpoint, we're typically talking about awe or amazement. So often spaces, even in scripture, that we see fear, it's translated from a word that is focused on, oof, wow, I am so amazed. The fear that we're talking about in OCD is terror. So I always say, describing authentic spirituality from OCD, when we're talking about fear, is it an eek or is it an awe? And that might sound really silly, but is it the eek fear or is it the wow? This is really amazing type fear. And being able, when we get into the eek fear, I like to say, good sign that there might be an OCD piece in there. Also, being able to recognize, is there an obsession? Is there discomfort? And is there a compulsion? Are we engaging in something specifically because we're having this intrusive thought and this discomfort that we're trying to get rid of? That isn't about a spiritual struggle, it's about an OCD struggle.
That's a great answer. Eek
Thank
versus awe. Yeah. And why do you think OCD, especially scrupulosity, is often misunderstood or overlooked in religious communities?
Yeah, because it makes sense, and I've worked with so many. I love getting to do interfaith work. So I'm an ordained Protestant minister, but all the work I get to do is interfaith, which is super cool. And I've worked with so many different religious leaders from different backgrounds, and I like to say everybody that I've worked with is so well-meaning. They want to help the people in their congregation or in their community, but they just might not be exposed to what OCD is, which that's a huge passion for me. Actually, right now I'm doing a lot of seminary education because it's not something we learn. And when you don't learn what OCD is and you end up in a religious and spiritual community and you just see someone praying a lot and you see someone going to confession a lot or ritually washing a whole bunch, right? From the outside, it just looks like someone is trying to engage really deeply in their religious and spiritual tradition. And a lot of times, clergy aren't trained to ask the question of why, or what's the function of this behavior, or what's the emotion that's coming up when you're doing that. And when they're not, of course, externally, it just looks like someone is really faithful or trying to connect. So I think often it just goes overlooked because there isn't enough knowledge or there isn't enough training within faith communities for folks to recognize what's happening. I always, because I think sometimes there's a lot of fear in the OCD community about, well, my faith leader just wouldn't understand, and totally valid, especially in spaces where folks have experienced religious trauma or spiritual abuse. But I also always want folks to know that I have had so many more positive than negative experiences in talking with clergy who say, I didn't know. There's this person in my community for 5 years that I just thought was doing this and I didn't know. I wish I would have known. And sometimes I just really think it's a lack of knowledge.
It's so important. I talked to a number of people who suffer from all of this, and they'll say they went and talked to their clergy.
Yeah.
And regardless of the faith, they're person, and I'll say, "Well, what did they say?" And this kind of leads into the next question, but they'll tell me what the response was, and I'll go, "Oh, okay." So, what are some well-intentioned responses from clergy or loved ones? It doesn't have to be clergy; it could just be family member that can accidentally make OCD worse. We use it
Yes.
worse. Okay.
Oh, yes. This can be so big. Yeah, from family, from loved ones, and also from clergy. Of course, reassurance. We know reassurance is one that just fuels the fire that is OCD. And I think clergy often fall into this, especially because they just aren't aware. And someone's coming and they're saying, "But am I going to go to hell? Or am I sinning? Or am I doing this thing wrong?" And the clergy member just kind of wants them to feel better in that moment. And they're looking theologically and they're like, "This doesn't actually align with what we're talking about. So I'm just going to tell them, no, you were totally good." And the person walks out, and 2 seconds later, OCD pokes a hole in it and says, "Well, does that clergy person really know? Or did I explain it correctly?" Or, all of the things that it does. So, reassurance. Another is responding as if and I'll say it in kind of a different way too, but as if the thoughts are ego-systonic instead of ego-dystonic. So sometimes, especially if we're thinking about whether it's sexual thoughts or POCD or taboo related themes, someone might go to a clergy member or family member who doesn't know OCD and will just hear something that they aren't used to hearing, and they'll respond with some sort of shock. And then that person will feel so much shame of, "I can't believe I told them this." Now they're
Mm,
shocked because of my thought. They're judging my thought. Not remotely helpful at all. And then another response that I'll see often is telling individuals to pray harder or to engage in the practices more deeply, or maybe if you do it in this way, it'll get better. And again, of course, that's kind of what clergy are going to go to. That's what they know. They're trying to fix, they're trying to give an answer. Unfortunately, that answer is just feeding the OCD. One more, intellectualizing. A lot of times clergy will also respond with, "Hey, I'm going to give you this really specific scripture to look at, and this will kind of debunk the thing that you're experiencing." And for us, knowing that there's no amount of logic that is really going to outthink OCD. So I think there are some different ways to respond, which I'm happy to talk about what might be helpful as an alternative.
okay, yeah. I think context is always important. Defending the clergy out there, right? If somebody comes to them, it would be helpful to know. Like if you're struggling with OCD, it would be helpful, I think, to let your clergy member know I have
Yeah.
this disorder called OCD, right? Because if
Yeah.
the faith leader understands you have OCD and then hears the question, they're in a better position to be able to formulate a response, I think. And you can tell me I'm wrong on anything that I say here. If the faith leader hears that they have OCD, but doesn't do anything to educate themselves about people with OCD, then that's on the faith leader, right? They should take that on as a responsibility. If you're a faith leader tuning into this, I would think. So, how can faith communities become safer and more supportive spaces for people navigating OCD? What can the faith community do?
Yeah. I have lots of thoughts on this, and I so agree. I think faith communities and faith leaders in particular have a responsibility to learn about OCD and to talk about all the things that we're talking about now. But I'll say before that side, with someone who might be going to their faith leader and sharing that they have OCD, I do encourage folks to assume that they might not know what that means. So when I talk to folks every day, sometimes I'll even give them a little blurb to share with their faith leader to
Oh,
say, "Hey, so I have OCD, and I just want to go ahead and let you know it's something that makes me really doubt a lot of things about stuff that's important to me, especially my faith. And sometimes it makes me want reassurance, or it makes me want to get things right, or it makes me engage in practices in a certain way. And I just wanted to let you know that before you answer this question, because it would be really helpful if you know that reassurance isn't necessarily helpful for me." And even something like that sometimes can kind of prime the conversation a little bit. I talked with someone 2 weeks ago who actually went and shared something like that. We wrote it on a note card and it made a really big difference where they
mm,
actually kind of paused and were able to say, "I think we're getting into some reassurance here. I already answered that question, so I think we need to move forward."
good.
So,
Okay, that's all very helpful. I mean, and again, I think that anybody context is always important. It's helpful to know what you're dealing with, right? So that's different if you don't know what you're dealing with and you walk in, like for all the years that you suffered but never were never diagnosed and you're trying to figure it all out, right? So that's the part where you tell people if you're really struggling with anything that feels like anything we're talking about, go see a therapist, right?
yeah.
Go see a therapist. If you're in a leadership position, and it doesn't have to just be clergy, it could be any other, like a parent or anything else, and you see somebody who looks like they're struggling with what we're talking about, it would be helpful if you would educate yourself, right?
Yes.
Find out what's going on. Together, I think if both sides will meet somewhere in the middle. Okay, let's talk about like one of my favorite things.
Hold on. I wanna say what they should do, though. I just that was on the
Oh,
individual side, so what would
okay,
be
go ahead.
helpful. Yeah. So, for clergy and for faith communities to be safer spaces for folks with OCD, the education piece is so huge, and I would definitely encourage faith communities, faith leaders in particular, to get educated. There are so many great resources. The International OCD Foundation, we have a whole, kind of resource page with things specific for clergy. We also have the Faith and OCD Conference, which will be the 6th annual coming this fall, where we have a whole track for clergy. So IOCDF will be putting that on together with Stick with the Ick, and there'll be a whole track for clergy to learn how to respond, how to recognize OCD. And then with Stick with the Ick, we're actually launching an Ick Scrupulosity Training Institute later this year that has a whole clergy track where even chaplains can get CEs and things like that, and they're able to engage and learn and kind of learn what's supportive to clergy. But on the tangible side, I always say a faith community has a couple really important roles. They have the role of helping to explain what is normative within that particular community. So a religious leader being able to work alongside clinicians and even do an ROI and work with that person's clinician to say this is what we typically do in our faith community and this is how this goes beyond that. A faith community can also be really helpful, or a faith leader, in actually working alongside the therapist to talk about culturally responsive exposures and what would be really helpful based on what they're doing in the community. And finally, I always say learning how to offer support and affirmation without reassurance. So, not reassuring the content, but showing up alongside the emotion that the person is experiencing in that faith community. So, for a clergy member to be able to sit with them and say, man, I know you're experiencing so much guilt and shame and fear and anxiety right now. And we can even look to a particular text in our religious tradition to get comfort about that. And I'm not going to talk to you about that content, but I am going to talk to you about hope and sit with you in the midst of this really hard emotion.
So say it one more time. What is going to be offered at the conference?
The IOCDF, or the Faith and OCD Conference, we will have a track for clinicians, clergy, and individuals with OCD. And then Stick with the Ick, we're going to have, starting in 2 months, a training institute that has a full
Oh,
training track for
okay, two
clergy.
separate thing. Okay, good.
Two separate
All right,
things.
so let's move to stick with the egg. When I first heard that name and it was associated with you, I knew exactly. It's funny that it's such a really good way to describe the whole thing, all of OCD, what you need to do for recovery, the feeling that you have when you have OCD. So let's talk about Stick with the Ick. You founded this community, Stick with the Ick. What does that phrase mean? And how did the idea originate?
Yeah. So the phrase stick with the ick, it's kind of tied back to both ERP and to ACT of let's stick with the really difficult thoughts, emotions, and feelings and not try to get rid of them. Let's let them be there as we move toward everything that's really meaningful to us. And it came out of, for a long time, I was saying, sit with it, but that didn't really, I don't know, the sitting with it in a chair thing didn't really jive with me. But I was like, well, I'm just going to stick with it. I'm going to let it be here while I do things. And I kept saying, stick with it. And at some point, somebody responded and they thought I had said, stick with the ick, but I had said, just stick with it. And it just was this really cute, catchy phrase. I was like, oh, okay, stick with the ick. That really resonates. So I ended up starting to say that in my own treatment journey and in the advocacy kind of work that I was doing. And it really stuck. So it kind of became a piece in my social media where I just started saying, okay, stick with the ick, stick with all of the icky feelings and the thoughts and the things like that. And then as I was moving through my doctoral program, I was doing my research on reimagining ERP as a spiritual practice. And coming out of that, I recognized that there was this really big need for community and connecting folks with one another. And it's really what Stick with the Ick came out of as this kind of app and virtual community, and it needed a name. And I started to think, man, well, this community is all about us sticking with the ick. It's literally about us sticking with really hard and challenging things while moving together towards something that's really important to us. So that's kind of what the name came out of.
And so for somebody who, well, I think it's beautiful. And by the way, at the annual IOCDF conference, I visited your little station or on Vendor Row. It is amazing what you have created. Just
Yeah.
the visual on what you've created is very powerful, very inspiring.
So
For somebody who doesn't, let's say, suffer from this religious scrupulosity theme with OCD, can they be helped by looking into Stick with the Ick?
yeah, absolutely. I get that question a lot from folks. And I always go back to yes, we do a lot around scrupulosity because that's, we think there's a need for that. But we are open to really anybody. And a big component is, again, OCD is gross ice cream that happens to come in a lot of different nasty artificial flavors. Scrupulosity is just one flavor of that. So, really, the support that we're offering is for anyone. And it's also for individuals and clinicians and clergy who are just passionate about the intersection of faith and OCD, or even the conversations that you and I were just having about how can we educate or how can folks talk with their clergy members. So the community itself, it's shifted and changed throughout the years, but we're coming up on April 1st on our 2-year anniversary. And we are essentially a mobile app and community and all sorts of different things that has, so you can actually download it, all sorts of stuff. But we have all these different facets, and we have support groups, we have events running all throughout the week, we have 24/7 chats and forums and themes of the week all around faith, OCD, and scrupulosity. And then within our groups, we actually have groups for people of different religious and spiritual traditions and affinity groups. And everything is run by either clergy who are trained on OCD or clinicians or both. And then we also offer consultations with different clergy from different religious traditions for clinicians to be able to work with or individuals with OCD. And then there's this kind of training institute piece coming too. But we have about 2,000 ICSTers who are walking this journey together of faith and OCD from around the world. So most of our groups will have folks from 5 or 6 different religious and spiritual traditions talking about what this looks like in Islam or in Hinduism or in Judaism or in Christianity, coming together.
That is so amazing. I just so proud of you. I
Thank
mean, that
you.
really has blossomed. And I will say also, I knew the answer to the question that I asked already about how broad Stick with the Ick goes. In my own experience, I actually I do daily affirmations for people. And what I wrote about today was kind of topical, knowing I was
I
talking.
just saw it this morning. It was
Yeah,
beautiful.
thank you. But my first point was I said there were two things that I wanted to talk about. One is how OCD affected me about my own faith, but I had 7 other what you would like broad general themes of OCDs. Religious scrupulosity was just one of them. What I learned ultimately was the same thing that I used to recover from all of the other ones, the same things that I would do didn't change. It applied to all of them. The process, the details, the content, maybe apart from being able to identify it as come from OCD, the details and content did not govern what I did next with it. And then the other thing I wrote was my faith in God helped me immensely. It really was. I had nowhere else to turn, nowhere else to turn, and I turned to God. And I get in this conversation a lot, and I don't want to like derail this conversation, but a lot of people Maybe you can address this. Let's this is a surprise question for you.
No, I'm excited. This is my favorite topic. So,
I talk to a lot of people who get angry with God because they're suffering so much, and they say, I'm praying to God to take this away, to cure me. Everything else, God is not listening. God is not listening." And I just draw from my own personal experience on what happened to me. I prayed for God to give me strength to show me the way, and God showed me a way, and I walked down that path. I did my part, and what I try to tell people is it isn't that God isn't listening to you, right? It may not be like if you just grow up from the Christian faith, Jesus walking up and rubbing your eyelids so that you can now see again. God is showing you the way. There's a piece of this that you have to do your part, but certainly God has shown you the path. And so take the path. That's how I looked at it. That's what I did. My faith in God, as much as OCD tried to destroy it, it was immeasurably helpful to me moving forward. So, what do you say to people who say to you, and they may even feel guilty and shameful for having the thought that they're mad at God. What do you say to people who are mad at God because of the way they suffer?
yeah. And that's what you just I was just gonna say, so many people feel guilt and shame about that, and they typically feel the anger and then are like, "Oh, I'm not supposed to be mad at God. Why am I feeling this way?" And I usually start by normalizing the fact that it's actually okay to feel frustrated, even at God. I usually go back to the Psalms, and if it's someone from the Christian or the Jewish faith, and remind them that the Psalms include psalms of thanksgiving and psalms of praise, but also psalms of lament. And most of them are actually psalms of lament and crying out to God and saying, "Why are we experiencing this?" And that if we're called to be in real, authentic relationship with God, as a parent figure, it's okay for us to feel frustration the same way that we sometimes do toward our parents, our own parents, that we call up and say, "I'm really mad right now that this thing is going on." And we can feel that. We can express that as a part of our faith. I'll encourage people to include that in their prayers. And at the same time, I'll also remind them that it does not mean that God is not listening and that God really is there with them, walking alongside them, holding their hand, even if it's a way that feels a little different from what we might be looking for or expecting. And I'll often encourage folks that we don't have to solve it, we don't have to know the answer, but that a big part of our faith is continuing to step forward in the midst of that uncertainty and recognizing that the answer that we're looking for, the answer to prayer, it might not look exactly like that, but I often encourage folks to think that it might be even more beautiful than we imagined. So I believe that I don't believe that God creates brokenness in our life theologically, but I believe that God walks with us through it and helps us to put things back together. So for me, I saw my life completely shattered on the floor in 10,000 pieces. And all I prayed for was for them to go back together exactly like they were before. And they didn't. They went back together in a different way. And I actually think it's a way that's even more beautiful than it possibly could have been without the things that I experienced. And for me, that's a huge part of faith is recognizing God put this back together in a different way and help me to put this back together in a different way and in a way that I have a lot of gratitude for. And um, yeah, there's something really beautiful about that.
Yeah. That's amazing too, because you kind of put yourself back into that thing and say, if someone would have told you, would have told you at that point, this is what it's going to look like now, 5 years, 10 years from now, you'd be like, yeah, right.
Oh, yeah, I didn't think
Um,
I'd be here. I didn't think I'd be here. I know, Shannon, I've told you this before, but I remember at my lowest points, I have, like, some really specific memories about being in the midst of losing people in school chaplaincy. My OCD was on fire. I was confessing to the police, and I was training for an Ironman at the time too, so I was going out on bike rides, ruminating for 7 hours, and I would get back, and I would actually look at your posts, and I'd be like, "Okay, I might be able to do this thing because Shannon did this thing." And it was really inspiring to me, and that was always a lifeline for me. And at the same time, I was like, that if you would have told me that I would be here now, no way. And that was a huge piece. So my doctoral work actually compared ERP to a spiritual practice because of the uncertainty, where we're required to, with ERP, to step forward in the midst of uncertainty and with
yeah.
fear. And a spiritual practice, I always define as anything that you're doing that's hard in an effort to connect with God. And that's what ERP is, making an effort to do something hard and without certainty to make OCD smaller so that we can reconnect with God. And I always tell folks when you're doing ERP, especially the biggest, hardest, scariest exposures and doing the response prevention, that is a prayer. That is you stepping toward God.
That's very powerful and beautiful. Everything, not the part about me, but everything.
That's beautiful too, because you do need
Um,
faith.
okay, so let's talk individually to the people who are struggling here. For people who are struggling right now, what does compassionate, effective treatment for religious scrupulosity look like?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of exposure and response prevention as the first line gold standard treatment for OCD. And I think that can feel really scary for individuals with scrupulosity because often they'll say, well, am I going to be asked to do an exposure that opposes my faith? Or I don't know, am I gonna be moving away from my faith by doing hard exposures? And I want folks to know that ERP does not involve doing things that oppose your faith or stepping away from your faith. It involves doing things that are challenging and maybe practicing your faith in a way that feels imperfect. That as you're doing that, and as you're working with a trained clinician, you are really actually learning how to reconnect with your faith. So I always say values driven exposures in ERP can be really beautiful, compassionate ways to engage. And really, I'm a big fan of the fact that we have to be uncomfortable in order to reconnect with our faith. And often the biggest exposures for folks are walking back into their church, their mosque, their synagogue, and letting intrusive thoughts be there, or opening that religious text in the midst of having a little bit of an OCD spiral. It might be ritually washing just one time before going to Friday prayer. Might be through the month of Ramadan, a lot in our Muslim community, we're really struggling with needing to check to make sure that they didn't get any water in their mouth when they took a shower. It might be not checking that and saying maybe, maybe not. Now, all of that might seem in the moment like you're doing something that opposes your faith. But the reality is, you're taking the biggest possible leap of faith to be able to get closer to God and to stop worshiping OCD. So I think engaging in that treatment, doing the exposures, focusing on the response prevention, doing all of that with your clinician, and at the same time, giving yourself so much love and compassion that you don't have to get it right, that you don't have to do it perfectly, and that God loves you in the midst of that. And I always go back to there's kind of three pieces with compassionate ERP around religious scrupulosity for folks to remember. I always say God knows and understands what you're experiencing across traditions. That if God is all powerful, then God knows why you're engaging with ERP to really reclaim your life. God is all knowing, then God understands the struggles that you're experiencing with these exposures. And that if God is all loving, then God walks alongside you in the midst of it. And that we can hold all of that while engaging with ERP.
Yeah, I have a little triangle that I talk about. It's the top of the triangle, the word explanation. Then we have the word justification at the lower left
Yep.
point, and then we have the word purpose. And so you can put all of this under the perspective. But obviously, I feel the way I do. I'm having these challenges because I have OCD. That's the explanation. But down under justification, because everything that we're doing in order to try to get better, like ERP or whatever you're doing, that's depriving OCD, it feels very counterintuitive, counter to my faith, counter to everything. You are justified. You're justified in taking these what feel like counterintuitive questions, and and being able to tell yourself that God understands, I think is extremely helpful in that regard. Okay, so let's pivot to clinicians here. How can clinicians practice exposure and response prevention in ways that respect a person's faith tradition rather than dismissing it?
Yes. This is so important. I'm really passionate about culturally responsive treatment and wanting clinicians to recognize the unique and individual, beautiful nuances across faith traditions and even within the sects and denominations of those traditions. So I always tell clinicians first, really get to know your client and get to know their faith background. And that doesn't mean that you have to be a religious expert. That's why there's folks in this community who do group work. You can reach out to us if you have questions, we can talk about it, but also ask your client. And there's a model that chaplains use called FICA, and it's FICA. And I always encourage clinicians to start with this. And it's F is faith. What is your faith? What does that look like? What do you do? Tell me about what others do in your community. I, what is the importance? What about that is important to you? What brings you joy and meaning and connection? C is community. Well, tell me about your community. What do others engage in? How do they support you? How do you feel support from them? And A, address in care. How do you want me to address this in your care? Would you like me to talk to your priest, your rabbi, your imam? Are there resources you'd like me to look to fully understand your tradition? I really want to show up and be there for you. So that's FICA. And I think that can be a great place to start. But then in the development of exposures, I think it's really important to think about how can we create a level of discomfort with exposures without crossing the line into something that might be in opposition to someone's faith tradition. So I like to use the 80-20 rule of what would 80% of folks within a community be willing to engage in order to get better, or a principle of discomfort versus disrespect. And by that, I mean, you can ask someone, why don't you want to engage in this exposure? And I say, why don't you? Because no one's ever going to want to engage in a good exposure. I've never walked into therapy and said, I am so pumped to do this really hard exposure. But the why you wouldn't want to matters. And if the answer is, well, I'm scared and I think God might be mad at me and this feels really probably a great exposure. But if they point to a specific text and say, well, this is in opposition to my faith, and this in this doctrine, it tells me I shouldn't be doing this thing, that might be something that you want to evaluate. We want somebody to have discomfort without it crossing a line of something that is actually forbidden within their tradition. And for clinicians, I know that can feel scary. And I actually tend to see clinicians going on the not hard enough side more than the other side because they're nervous about crossing the line. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to talk to you. That's one of the primary things I do is consulting with clinicians. And a big part of our training institute that's launching later this year too is we're doing interfaith literacy for clinicians, where we're going to be walking through different faith traditions, understanding tenets of faith. How do obsessions and compulsions show up? How do we do culturally responsive treatment? So if folks want resources around that too, I'm very passionate about hopefully continuing to create things for folks in that area.
Yeah, in the same way that we were talking about clergy, and I had another question. I think you've answered it already. So I'll just say this that we said before, you said before, clergy would be better suited, best suited to educate themselves about OCD, right?
Mhm.
And certainly if a clergy member has a question about OCD, they could call you, right? They
Mhm.
could say, hey, what about this? Anybody could just pick up the
Yeah.
phone or email you or whatever. But also on the clinician side, if you're dealing with, if you have a legitimate question about what to do because you've just seen this and you're sort of in this wedge between I don't know what to do with this because we have the intersection of faith and the intersection of ERP. What do I do? Reach out, educate yourself to somebody who understands, like they reach out to you. That you're performing an incredible service to both, well, to all three communities, probably four communities: clergy, clinician, sufferer, and family member. But it really is unique in the sense that clergy members and clinicians can come out to you and talk about this really very delicate. It's a very delicate area because I can see the gray areas. When you were just talking, in my mind, I came up with like 10 gray areas about
Oh, there's like 10,000 gray
I'm
areas.
sure, yeah. So go back to my first ground rule of you don't have to be perfect at this,
No.
right? You don't because you're not going to be perfect at this. So take that burden off your shoulders. Do your best. But education is really important. All right. So I mentioned family members. For family members or loved ones who are watching someone struggle with scrupulosity, what are some helpful ways they can support recovery?
Gosh, I think very similar to some of the things that we've talked about for clergy and for clinicians, but of course, education and kind of really thinking, well, how can I show up and offer support for my loved one without offering reassurance or out without reinforcing the OCD? I think especially with scrupulosity, I see this as really hard for family members who their faith is also really important to them. And they see sometimes even more so loved ones wanting to offer reassurance or point to scripture or say, no, it really is going to be okay because it feels so big as a family and having them know that might not be the most helpful in those moments. but there's other things they can do that are helpful. And I always encourage family members to support the feeling as opposed to talking about the content. So, similar to what I said with clergy, family member, if your loved one is struggling and is in the loop of, oh my goodness, is God mad at me? What if this? What if that? You can sit down next to them and say, we're kind of on that what if train. This sounds a lot like what we've been talking about with OCD, and I'm not going to talk to you about the content. And I want to sit with you in this emotion right now. I am willing to sit here with you in the midst of all of that fear and guilt and anxiety that are coming up. And is there a skill or tool that you're working on with your therapist right now that we might be able to lean on together? And that's my favorite piece for Scroop or really any type of OCD for family
Mhm.
members to really show up for that feeling and not to walk away, but to be there in that without talking about the content. And my partner Ethan and I both have OCD, and our OCD, we're both in recovery, but it still sometimes, comes up and likes to get a little loud. And that's how we try to support each other. I would not respond well if Ethan was just like, okay, now it's OCD. I'm not going to talk to you about this. But I respond really well when he says, not going to talk to you about the content, but I know this sucks. And I'm going to sit with you in the feeling.
Mm. Yeah, well, you guys are absolutely my favorite couple. I just love you both. I mean, individually, both of you are impacting this community in ways that, to use this word again, immeasurable, really. I mean, you have such a positive impact on people who are going through, and we all know what it feels like suffer with OCD. The fact that you two are doing what you do is just amazing to me. And then together, multiply that by a billion, and when, even when you say Ethan, my partner, that I know that together you guys are just, when you're physically seen together, it has an impact on people as both of you do individually. So anyway, I love you both dearly.
We love you.
Thank you. In the interest of time, let me see if we have any questions here. I didn't see any. You and Matthew are actually knocking it out of the park on chat, and I'm just watching it happen. Matt has put your resources out here.
Matt is, we love Matt. Matt has been such a supporter of Stick with the Egg too and Faith
Oh
in
yeah, he's
Work.
great. I love,
Matt Bannister times 10,000. We love you, Matt.
and he has a better accent than we do.
He does so much better. I
Yeah,
did learn during a Stick with the game night that he doesn't do guacamole in the UK, and I was like baffled by this.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
So let me ask a question, my final question of you, Katie. And again, thank you so much for being here. You're just really, really is an honor for me that you said yes to participating in
It
this.
was an honor to me that you asked. I was so excited that you asked me alongside that list of humans, and
Yeah, well,
especially with what I shared with you, it really I can think about that rainy day and getting back from that bike ride and doing what I always did, which was look at your Facebook and thinking, "Man, like, it was my glimmer of hope. If Shannon can do this and talk about this, maybe I can too."
yeah, well, that's the rickety bridge analogy, right? I always tell people to say it this way: if that big dummy can do it, I can do it. So,
No.
um, but yeah, no, you are so awesome, Katie, the real Katie O'Dunn.
The real Katie.
I have that. I won't say it here, but I have that story that you and I can forever cherish. All right. If someone listening feels trapped between their faith and their OCD, what would you want them to hear most clearly, and where can everyone learn more about you and access your services? Two questions, and as my final question, but what do you tell somebody who's like right in that gray area?
Yeah.
What do you say to them? And then tell us a little bit more, because I'll post this at the end of the interview when I edit it and put it out about where people can find you, but you can go ahead and talk about it. But let's cover both of those questions and then we'll call it a day.
Okay. So I would tell anybody who's listening, who's kind of in it right now, that one, I'm so sorry. And I know the feelings. It sucks. It absolutely sucks. And I remember being there, and I remember honestly feeling somewhat frustrated when people would tell me that it would get better because I felt like it wouldn't for me. And like mine was different, or it was just too extreme or too intense, or the thoughts or the feelings were too intense. And I just want you to hear that I get it and it does suck. And also, you are not alone. And the recovery piece that we're talking about, it doesn't just apply to everybody else, it applies to you too. And you can do this. And this is not a faith issue as much as it feels like it. It is an OCD issue. It's OCD latching on to your faith and to everything that you so deeply care about. And by doing things like engaging in treatment, you are taking the biggest possible leap of faith to step back toward the big, beautiful, awesome life that you really were created to live. And you can do this.
And then where can people find your stuff?
Yeah, I would love for people to find me, especially, I mean, of course, anyone who's navigating OCD and family members, but also clinicians and clergy, especially as we launch the training stuff and again, put on the Faith and OCD conference with IOCDF later this year. So they can find me. Faithandocd.com is probably the easiest because it has ways to access us in the app, both in our free spaces and in all of our community and group spaces. It has all of our consultations and my information. But if you are like, I just want to do app stuff, you can also go to stickwiththeick.com, or you can download the Stick with Ike app on iOS or on Google Play. But again, faithandocd.com, easy to remember. It has all of our stuff and contacts right there. If folks head over there, yeah, feel free to. And I am very responsive and try to be on email, and the app is free to download and there's messaging there too. So if folks have questions for me, you can also download that and you can message me, and I am pretty much always always there answering questions. So folks can message me anytime with group questions too.
Well, that's beautiful. You guys enjoy Colorado.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you at the conference this year in Seattle, I think is where it is.
Yes, I'm so excited.
Yeah, it'll be fun. And then we can take another picture with you and the other Katie. So,
Yes.
again, thank you so much. You were so awesome. I really am honored that you came on. Your message is so important. I'm so proud of you too. I wish I was half the go-getter that you are. So,
You
um,
inspired me.
oh,
We're
well,
doing it together.
this is the Mutual Appreciation Society. So, take care. Matthew, thanks for all you do as well.
Matt,
And
thank you. We love you.
yeah, we do. We love you, Matt. And we'll call it a day. I will edit this and put it out a little bit later today or tomorrow, and then we'll go. So give Ethan our regards, my regards, and we'll talk later. Okay.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you,
All
Matt.
right.